Professor Oded Lifshitz from the Department of Archaeology and Ancient Near Eastern Cultures at Tel Aviv University is inviting you to join him to a journey following those who composed the historical descriptions in the Hebrew Bible.
The Untold Story of the Kingdom of Judah, Part C. Out of sight, out of mind, and far away in time. The Untold Stories of the Lowlands, the Shvela, and its history. Chapter 3. The Untold Story of Moreshet-Gath, or was the home of Micah the Moreshite in Azekah. The power and wealth of Azekah, as demonstrated by the richness of the finds that were excavated at the site, its strong fortifications from the Middle Bronze Age, the size of the city in the Late Bronze Age, the strategic location of the site and the control it has of the main roads connecting the hill country in the east and the coastal area in the west, alongside the rich agricultural potential of the Elah Valley. All of these allowed this site to become a central and important settlement in the second millennium BCE. In the Middle Bronze Age and in part of the beginning and the end of the Late Bronze Age, Azekah also became one of the main geopolitical forces in the area between Beth Shemesh in the north and Lachish in the south, and this as long as Gath, Tel Etzafi, had declined and could no longer control the entire area around it and to prevent Azekah from growing and developing. In light of this, an important question arises. What was the name of this city in the second millennium BCE? In my opinion, the original and ancient name of Tel Azekah was Moreshet. This is the same as Mukhrashtu, which is a city mentioned in one of the Elah letters, or Moreshet-Gath, the city of the prophet Micah, who is Micah the Moreshite. I wish to explain. Azekah is not mentioned in any source from the second millennium BCE. In fact, not before the period of Judah's rule in the region in the 8th century BCE. The Hebrew root of the place name Azak, Ain Zain Kuf, appears in the Hebrew Bible only once as a verb in the book of Isaiah chapter 5 verse 2, and I can read it within verses 1 to 3. Let me sing for my well-beloved, a song of my beloved touching his vineyard. My well-beloved had a vineyard in a very fruitful hill, and he digged it, vayazkehu, and gathered out the stones thereof, vayesaklehu, and planted it with the choicest vine, vaitaehu sorek, and built a tower in the midst of it, and also hewed out a winepress therein. And he looked that it should bring forth grapes, and it brought forth wild grapes. End of quote. Based on its appearance in this verb, the verb azak is generally understood to mean digging, perhaps digging beds for planting seedlings. I assume that this name was given to Azekah by the kings of Judah after they took control of the Elah Valley area during the 8th century BCE. It was a second new name of a Judean origin for an existing city that had a different name in an area that had never before been connected to the hill country and was never part of the kingdom of Judah. During this period, Gath had already disappeared from the world, decades after it was destroyed by Hazael, the king of Aram Damascus. Its existence was no more than a memory, and its place in history could not be denied, but as part of the new ownership of the area by the king of Judah, the place was given a new name, which erased Gath from its previous hold on the area and also expressed the standing and the importance of the place from Judah's point of view as part of the king's royal estate which after Judean rule was established in the city and the area around Azekah, it was necessary to utilize its full potential for the benefit of the kingdom. This is not the place to discuss the tendency of the Jerusalem kings and their representatives in the writing of history and reshaping it to give new names to places according to the wishes and interests of the kingdom. Some of the names were thrown back, presented as ancient names for familiar places from present days when the stories were written and history was used for shaping the ideology of that time. These seemingly ancient names were incorporated in their ancient attire into the history of the kingdom, such as, for example, Kiryat Arba or Kiryat Ha'arba for Hebron, or Yevus, Zion, the stronghold of Zion, Mount Zion, city of David, and other names, all of which are projection of the present on the past or on the future of Jerusalem. In some cases, the names were polemic, and they also serve the purpose of the historiography. Such, for example, is the case of Bethel and Bet Aven, Baala or Kiryat Baal, which is Kiryat Yarim, or Kiryat Sefer, which is Dvir. Many new rulers throughout history did exactly the same thing, whether they were the ancient empires that took control of vast and distant lands, or just local kingdoms that conquered territories from neighboring kingdoms and established their rule by giving new names to existing places. This practice is common, well known, existed throughout human history, and also exists in modern history. Notably, place names have been changed without consulting the local population, and certainly against the wishes of the local residents who mostly wanted to keep the name of the place where they lived and stick to the traditions they knew. Furthermore, the local population usually didn't accept the name change imposed on them by the new rulers and kept the old name side by side with a new one, even if it has become the official name. And so, for example, all speakers of Semitic languages who lived throughout history in Beit She'an, Arabic Bisan, or in Beit Guvrin, Beit Gabra, Arabic Beit Jubril, continued to call the places of settlement by the same names which have been preserved in Hebrew and Arabic to this day, even though these places received new names from the empires that ruled there, names that were preserved throughout history alongside the ancient names. Thus, Skytopolis was the Greek name of Bet Shean, and Eleuteropolis, city of free men, was the new name given by the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus to Bet Guvrin in 200 CE. In all these cases, the places of settlement had double names which were maintained for many years. Indeed, throughout its history, the land of Israel, known for many hundreds of years also as Canaan, and for many hundreds of years also as Palestine, is full of such examples. In the same way, I would like to suggest that although Azekah was a new name given to this place during the 8th century BCE by the new masters, the kings of Jerusalem from the house of David, the inhabitants of the place continued to call Azekah by the traditional and ancient name of their city, like Micah the Moreshetite, for example, who was one of them. In the Deuteronomistic historiographic descriptions, Azekah is mentioned twice in the description of Joshua's pursuit of the 5 kings of the south in Joshua chapter 10, verses 10 and 11. I'm quoting, "And Yahweh discomfited them before Israel, who slew them with a great slaughter at Gibeon, and chased them along the way that goeth up to Beth Horon, and smote them as far as Azekah and Makedah, And as they fled before Israel, while they were going down the ascent to Beth Horon, Yahweh threw down great stones from the heaven upon them as far as Azekah, and they died. There were more who died because of the hailstones than the men of Israel killed with the sword. End of quote. The city is also mentioned in the list of lowland cities in Joshua 15, verse 35, as well as in the story of the battle between David and Goliath in the first book of Samuel 17, verse 1. I'm quoting. Now, the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Socho, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Socho and Azekah in Ephes Damim, in no blood. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. End of quote. This is the name by which the prophet Jeremiah also knew the place, and this is how it remembered in Jeremiah 34, verses 6 and 7. Then Jeremiah the prophet spoke all these words to Zedekiah king of Judah in Jerusalem. When the army of the king of Babylon was fighting against Jerusalem and against all the cities of Judah that were left, Lachish and Azekah, for these were the only fortified cities of Judah that remained. End of quote. This is also the name by which the rulers of Lachish knew Azekah on the eve of the destruction, the same day as Jeremiah. And in ostraco number 4, that was found in the gate of Lachish from the period of the Babylonian destruction, they report to the king of Judah that, and I'm quoting, "And may my Lord be apprised that we are watching for the fire signals of Lachish according to all the signs which my Lord has given, because we cannot see Azekah." All the descriptions were written at the end of the 7th century BCE by those who lived in Jerusalem or were sent from it, knew Azekah by this name, and looked downwards toward this place from the height of the hill country. But this is also the name by which Sennacherib knew the Judean border city, and that's how he called it in the famous Azekah inscription known as Sennacherib Letter to God, the first extra biblical evidence to mention, twice even, the name Azekah. And I'm quoting, "The city of Azekah, his stronghold, which is between my border and the land of Judah, like the nest of the eagle, located on a mountain ridge, like pointed iron daggers without number reaching high to heaven. Its walls were strong and rivaled the highest mountains to the mere sight, as if from the sky appears its head. By means of beaten earth ramps, mighty battering rams, brought near the wall, with the attack by foot soldiers, my warriors, they had seen the approach of my cavalry, and they had heard the roar of my troops of the god Ashur, and their hearts became afraid. The city of Azekah I besieged, I captured, I carried off its spoil, I destroyed, I devastated, I burned with fire." End of quote. In my opinion, at the end of the 7th century BCE, when Azekah was resettled after a gap of 70 years since the destruction by Sennacherib, when the historical memory was already dim and the original inhabitants of the city had long ceased to live in the area, there was no doubt and to anyone that this was the name of the city. Indeed, it's doubtful whether, after its destruction by Sennacherib, the killing and exile of many of the inhabitants, and the abandonment of the entire area for a period of about 3 generations, the memory of the former name was even preserved at all. However, at the end of the 8th century BCE, on the eve of Sennacherib's campaign, and before the heavy destruction, when the ancient Elah Valley clan still lived on its land and the ancient inhabitants of the city still lived within it, even if they had already been under the rule of the Jerusalemite kings from the house of David for 2 or 3 generations, and even if the city had already been given a new Judean name, the name Moreshet or Moreshet-Gath was still preserved. The name appears for the first time in one of the El Amarna letters, number 335. The sender of this letter is Abdi Ashtarti, the successor of Shuardata, ruler of Gath. And the cities mentioned in the letter are Lachish, Mukhrashtu, Moreshet, and another unidentified place. From the description in the letter, which was sent to the king of Egypt, it is clear that Moreshet is an important place in the area between Lachish and Gath. Most researchers suggested to locate the city of Moreshet near the Guvrin stream, close to Lachish, looking for a site that existed in the late Bronze Age. Because it is mentioned in the prophet Micah's laments among the cities that were destroyed in Sennacherib's campaign, and is missing from the list of the cities of Judah in the lowlands in the book of Joshua, which characterizes the reality that existed in the 7th century BCE, researchers also assume that it was not rebuilt or restored after the Assyrian destruction. All the sites that have been proposed for Moreshet's identification are problematic in various respects, and there is no consensus among researchers. This is not the place to discuss this subject in detail, but notably, Azekah never emerged as a candidate for identification with Moreshet-Gath, both because the city's strength in the late Bronze Age was unknown until the recent excavation, and also because researchers assume that the name of the place in the 2nd millennium BCE was Azekah, even though it is not mentioned in any source from this period. Of course, it is impossible to prove this new identification proposal for Moreshet-Gath in Azekah, and it is a proposal that remains hypothetical. But my proposal is no less likely and perhaps even more likely than all the other identifications proposals for the place. Moreover, the idea that Azekah is a new and second name for the city that already had another, more ancient name, Moreshet, is exciting and opens up new possibilities for rethinking not only about the existence of multiple names in Judah and its surroundings during the biblical period, but also about the history of the region in the 8th and 7th century BCE. The meaning of this proposal is that from the moment Judah took control of the central lowlands, and especially of the Elah Valley, Azekah received its name and became the administrative center of this region, becoming an important fortress of the western border of the kingdom. All of this could not have happened before the destruction of the city Gath by Hazael, king of Aram Damascus, towards the end of the 9th century BCE, and in terms of the archaeological finds, it didn't happen before the beginning of the 8th century BCE and probably towards the middle of this century. We might assume that after the destruction of Gath, the Elah Valley clan could have rebuilt Azekah, and at the same time connections with Judah began to re-establish. The geopolitical vacuum created after the destruction of Gath and the weakness of the local clan, which had just begun to re-establish itself in Azekah, caused the kings of Jerusalem to establish their rule in the area of the central lowlands for the first time in the history of this region. No one knows how they did it, whether by peaceful means, by threats, by war, or a combination of some or all of these ways. But in any case, in the second half of the 8th century BCE, the Elah Valley and Azekah became an important component of the economy and administration of Judah, an inseparable part of the kingdom's territories. Together with the Sorek Valley to the north and the area of Moreshet and Lachish to the south, it also created a stable western line of defense at the border of the kingdom. Thus, a few decades later, when Sennacherib's army stood facing the western border of Judah, the place was called Azekah by the Assyrians, exactly as it was called by the kings of Judah in Jerusalem. At the same time, Micah the Moreshetite could have lamented the destruction of the cities of the lowlands, including the city where he was born and lived, Moreshet-Gath. Azekah was not mentioned in this lament, even though from both biblical and Assyrian sources, we know it was one of the most important places destroyed in the Assyrian campaign. This is certainly another point that strengthens the proposed identification of Moreshet-Gath at Azekah. Recall that Micah lived in the lowlands in the second half of the 8th century BCE as defined in the title of the book of Micah, chapter 1, verse 1. The words of Yahweh that came to Micah the Moreshetite in the days of Yotam, Achaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, which he saw concerning Samaria and Jerusalem. This is exactly the period of time in which the lowlands came under the rule of Judah, and during this period Micah still defined himself as Moreshetite and lived in a completely different shfela from what we know from the historiographical descriptions in the Hebrew Bible that reflect a reality of about 70 to 100 years later. The lament on the destruction of the cities of the lowlands is in the center of the book of Micah, and 10 cities were mentioned in their names: Bet Leofra, Shafir, Tza'anan, Bet Etzel, Marot, Lachish, Moreshet-Gath, Achziv, Maresha, and Adulam. Each of these cities is mentioned as a woman or a mother whom the speaker addresses with wordplays tying the names of Bet Leofra, Lachish, and Achziv to the occurrences in addressing them, and apparently additional wordplays can be found in the rest of the text. We can conclude from this that the cities mentioned in the lament were not chosen only because of their geographical proximity to each other in the Shfela or because of their strategic location, but mainly because of the sound and the meaning of their names. And so, after a verbatim quotation and a wordplay on the memory of Gath in David's lament, that we know from second book of Samuel, chapter 1, verse 20. So Micah is saying, verse 10, tell it not in Gath, weep not at all. The lament moves to the first two pairs of cities, which include the same pattern. One city left to mourn, and another city that was exiled. In the first, Bet Leofra wallows in the dirt on which Shafir is sitting after being exiled, while in the second, Tza'anan sits in its place and Bet Etzel is displaced. We can read it from verse 10 and 11. In Bet Leofra have I rolled myself in the dust, passed on your way, inhabitants of Shafir, in nakedness and shame. The inhabitants of Tza'anan do not come forth. The wailing of Bet Etzel shall take away from you its standing place. In the third pair of cities, connected to the previous two by means of the word for, ki, two cities are described, and apparently a late addition added the mention of Jerusalem, the daughter of Zion, and the crimes of Israel. Verse 12 mentioned that, I'm quoting, for the inhabitants of Marot wait anxiously for good. And verse 13 continued, harness the steed to the chariots, inhabitants of Lachish. In verse 14, there is a problem in describing the city of Moreshet-Gath, making it possible to accept the assumption that the second person reference to Lachish in the continuation of verse 13 is part of the later addition which state that you were the beginning of sin to the daughter of Zion, for in you were found the transgressions of Israel. Then the verb give is mentioned in relation to Moreshet-Gath and not to Lachish. Therefore, you shall give a parting gift to Moreshet-Gath. The houses of Achziv shall be deceitful things to the kings of Israel. In the fifth couple of the cities, in verse 15, it is said that I will yet bring unto thee, O inhabitant of Mareshah, him that shall possess thee, the glory of Israel shall come to Adulam. The meaning of this verse is that Moreshet will fall into the hands of the heir, most likely the enemy. The second city in this pair, Adulam, appears as a place to which the glory of Israel will come. In other words, Israel's honor will escape up to Adulam, a clear hint for a later Deuteronomistic addition to David's story cycle, since according to the first book of Samuel, chapter 22 verse 1 and chapter 23 verse 13, Adulam is where the founder of the dynasty hid. From this, it seemed that the original word of Micah, which apparently included verses 8, 9a, 10, 11, 12a, 13a, and 14 to 16, are a lament for the destruction of cities or for cities that are about to be destroyed. On the one hand, most of the places in the second part, in verses 13 to 16 in chapter A in Micah, are mentioned in other parts of the Hebrew Bible as sites of local importance and especially as fortified cities in the Shephelah. Moreshet-Gath is one of them. In contrast, the place names of the first part of the lament, Micah chapter 1 verses 10 to 12, which are not attested anywhere else in the entire Hebrew Bible, Bet Leofra, Shafir, Tza'anan, Bet Etzel, and Marot, may well refer to smaller unfortified towns, small villages, or even small peasantries that also lie in the Shephelah. Furthermore, the first part of the lament in verses 10 to 12 reflect upon current events. The inhabitants of the villages and peasantries mentioned in this part are to mourn and lament over a fate with which they had already been met. The villages and peasantries have already been destroyed. Some of the inhabitants of the towns flee while others are dead. Different from this is the second part of the lament, verses 13-16, where Moreshet-Gath is part of it, which refers to and reflects on future events. The fate of the towns in this second part has already been determined, but has not yet come to pass. The inhabitants of these towns are to prepare themselves for military conflicts. Thus, the first part of the lament in Micah chapter 1, verses 10 to 12, refers to events currently taking place in smaller villages or peasantries in the Shephelah, and the second part, verses 13 to 16, refers to events in the fortified cities that have not yet happened. These insights into the structure and message of the lament in Micah 1, verses 10 to 16, leads to one initial consequence for the identification of Moreshet-Gath. This town was one of the larger and stronger cities of the region and part of Judah's fortification system in the Shephelah. The lament makes it clear that the cities that were destroyed and whose inhabitants were exiled or about to be destroyed, offering a clue to the date of the writing of the lament itself, since the only historical event in the history of the kingdom of Judah in which the cities of the lowland were destroyed but Jerusalem remained is Sennacherib campaign in 701 BCE. Only a few of these cities were restored, and only part of them also appear in the list of cities of the lowlands in the book of Joshua, written in the days of King Josiah, about 80 years after Sennacherib's campaign. This indicates that we have a huge gap in the knowledge between those who lived and wrote the historiographical descriptions in the days of Josiah and the lowlands before Sennacherib's campaign. Moreshet-Gath was not well longer known during Josiah's period and is not mentioned in any source outside of the book of Micah. In my opinion, not because its fate was like the many small towns and villages that had been destroyed in the lowland and never rebuilt, but because at that time, when the historiographical descriptions were written, its name had already been forgotten and the name Azekah was established. The untold story of Moreshet-Gath not only expresses the time gap between the period before Sennacherib's campaign and the period after the Assyrian retreat from the Levant some 70 years later, but also further testifies to the forgetting of the memory of Moreshet-Gath in conjunction with the solidification of a new name into the collective memory, at least of Jerusalem residents. In the next chapter, we will complete the historical picture and discuss the untold story about the role of the lowlands in this very important event of Sennacherib's campaign. See you in the next chapter.